Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast, The Good Congress, a Sunwater Institute production. I'm your host, Brad Fitch, and I'll be walking you through a series of interviews with leading experts in Congress and democracy. The goal here is to identify what are the principles and path to a good Congress, explore strategies and proposals to improve congressional operations and outcomes, and hopefully build greater trust in American democratic institutions. Let's get started with today's guest. I am delighted to welcome to the show Brandice Canes-Wrone. She is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor at Stanford. Brandice, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Brad. It's great to be here.
Now, we're going to be talking about trust on this show because you've done a number of pieces of research and programs at Stanford on the topic of trust. And it obviously, at its core, is necessary in a democracy when you're dealing with the public or a constituency and those they elect to represent them, the governed and the governing. But let's start with a big picture question. Why is trust in Congress important in our democracy?
So Congress is the branch that our Constitution aims to give the most power. It's the one closest to the public. It's the people's branch. So when the public loses trust in Congress, it's really losing trust in what's designed to be, you could say, the heart and the lungs of our government. Higher trust is associated with compliance, so how much people comply with policies and laws. It's associated with greater participation. That includes voting. And it's also associated with less zero-sum thinking. When you don't trust Congress, you tend to think, oh, that side's winning. Kind of bipartisan compromise might not be a good thing. It means so less partisan. Maybe it's not that necessarily, I should say that better. It's not necessarily the bipartisan compromise. It's a bad thing, but less partisan animosity. You sort of trust the other party less. And so it's particularly problematic then when your party isn't in power. So low trust in Congress is, it has this kind of academic sound, and I am an academic, so I kind of hear that, oh, is this just something that academics care about? But this is something that has real consequences for how our democracy functions on a day-to-day basis.
And we both know that prior to Watergate and the Vietnam War, when asked the question, does the government do the right thing all or most of the time, the numbers was in the 60s and 70s, and it's been hovering around the 20s and teens and 30s at best.
Yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, so with the exception of after 9/11, it shot up over 50 for a month.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there are these kind of blips. Trust in government's gone way down, and trust in Congress has followed that pattern. And in fact, trust in Congress is even lower much of that period than trust in government. Although I think now they're a little more, because trust in government has gotten so low that now they can be low together. But often, and that relates to if trust in Congress is low, that often can actually predate the kind of lower trust in, because if Congress isn't doing much and everything's being done by the president and the courts, that's not a situation that fosters negotiation and compromise and a strong connection to the people.
Let's talk about the factors that contribute to either trust or a lack of trust in our democratic institutions. There are internal and external factors. Let's start with external factors that are largely outside of the control of Congress. What are some of those external factors that you think are contributing to a lower trust in Congress?
So, Brad, you mentioned that the high point was this kind of 50s and 60s, and then it starts declining. And that's during the period that social capital, civic engagement, and interpersonal trust start declining, and those continue to decline. And academics, these are hard things to tease out because, a lot's changing at once. But academics have tried to tease out, well, how much of this is sort of government performance, say how the economy's doing, versus social capital, civic engagement. And most of that research, the large bulk of it, suggests that sure, government performance matters. That would actually be bad if it didn't, at some level, if it didn't matter at all. But that this declining social capital and civic engagement exists even when government performance is good and helping. And so that's seen as a really strong, if not the primary driver, that when people are more engaged in their communities and civic organizations, they tend to trust the process more. They tend to, they're civically involved, and they're in some ways a much stronger part of the process, and they're interacting more with their fellow citizens. In more recent decades, there's also evidence that social media has polarized people in ways that make them trust the other party less. And that has contributed to recent declines. But it's worth noting, it's not the case, as we've already discussed, that, oh, everything was fine and then social media came along, and then things were a problem. It was already, the decline pre-existed social media, but then social media contributed even further.
I just want to back up your point about civic engagement with a case study I stumbled onto. The National Conference on Citizenship annually gives awards to certain examples of great engagement by communities and cities. And there was an Arizona city that had to, frankly, look at their budget and realize they had this massive hole in their budget. And so what they decided to do is they came up with a tax increase plan, primarily around property taxes, but they engaged in what can only be called a massive facilitated process to engage different stakeholders in the community, from business leaders to schools
Yes.
to every, community associations. And overwhelmingly, not only did the communities approve of the increase in taxes, but remarkably, after the tax increase passed the city council, every city council member was reelected. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was and they were talking, the mayor was there at this event, and he was talking about how engaged they were. And it was interesting. It was both around the pandemic, so there was some virtual and there was some in person. So they mixed it up a little bit. But they were fascinated that they actually were able to pull it up. But they said it all was about civic engagement and engaging stakeholders and making them feel as though they had a stake in and a say
Yes.
in what was happening.
Yes. Yeah. No, exactly. And that translates not only to local government, but also to kind of national government as well. That sort of trust makes one feel more engaged with all levels.
I'm going to come back at the end of the interview and talk a little about what they can do to help with that engagement, though,
Okay.
because
Okay.
that's a definitely. So I'm going to put that in a parking lot and come back to
Okay.
it. Let's turn internally. Well, before we get done with external factors, I also want to touch on, let's face it, Hollywood does not do Congress any favors, right? I mean,
Yes.
West Wing kind of got it right, in terms of what motivated people, but House of Cards, they got the decorations in the majority leader's office right, and after that, it just went south, and it was complete fantasy. Do you think that Hollywood's portrayal of government and Congress helps contribute to a lack of trust?
So I do, and I'm going to separate that. There's also the news media, which we should probably
Right,
say a
right.
bit about. But let's just start with. So I'm going to focus first. We'll focus first on entertainment shows. Most of what we know as scholars about the impact of entertainment shows has been done. The research has been done on presidential candidates and particular policy views. All of those studies, though, suggest that the entertainment shows are much more influential than commonly appreciated. And actually, now I think this is pretty well known, but early on, right, Trump took people by surprise a bit in, the Republican Party,
A
right, in
bit?
2015. And well, the performance, and, Trump had run previously as a presidential candidate. Trump had even come down the elevator previously. And I think a strong argument of what changed is The Apprentice, right?
Yeah.
He suddenly had a presence with Americans, and other shows, and that then includes there's been kind of studies of reality TV shows and how those affect policy views. Those suggest they have a much bigger impact than, this is where academics have often, of course, these are academic studies, so we're getting there, but academics have often focused much more on, the hard news, the hard news media. That's a whole field of study. Whereas, it was sort of, well, who would study reality TV or who would study, but in fact, that's what people are watching. So in some ways that, in big numbers. And yes, so that all of what we have suggests that in this golden age of media in particular, when the audience has the option of opting out of hard news, and they go to their TVs or devices for entertainment, these shows matter a lot. And of course, entertainment shows tend to be dramas, like House of Cards, as you mentioned. So they're villains. They can be really well done comedies. I loved Veep. I thought it was, but it's a problem. So the problem isn't Veep or House of Cards, but it is a problem if that's your only perception and you actually don't, take it with more of a great, as an entertainment show. And I think this effect is likely exacerbated by the fact that the emphasis on civics in K through 12 curriculum has declined in the 21st century. And so over the past few decades, there's particularly among younger people, less factual knowledge that's competing with these entertainment
Mm,
portrayals. So that
yeah.
again makes it, yeah, can compound, so it's always, I don't want to be kind of blaming Hollywood. That seems a little unfair. Veep is, it's this great show, House of Cards, they're designed to do something different. But it's a problem if we don't have great civics education, and if people are checking out of the news and this becomes the primary source. Now, it's not really Hollywood's fault, but it's creating a very problematic situation, kind of in the vacuum of this other information.
The example I cite was an Amazon show called Alpha House with John Goodman, and
Yeah,
which the pilot is still one of the funniest parodies of Congress. I actually do like it in the part that it parodies Congress, I think, very well. But there's a
yeah,
scene in which one senator is picking up another senator to go look at the house that he may move into. He's in a limo with his mistress drinking champagne. And I'm like,
yeah,
yo, I know the most wealthy senator for many years with Herb Kohl of Wisconsin. He drove a Chevy Camino.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
No politician would be caught dead in a limousine. The only
yeah.
people driving limousines are Hollywood types that come here to make shows about Congress.
Right,
I mean, it's
right, right.
ridiculous. And so it is a little of me yelling at the TV times, saying
Yes, yes,
that's not true. That doesn't work like that.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
it is a challenge, and when they get it right, it's actually fun. And there were certain pertinent aspects of both Alpha House and Veep where the relationship conversation between the
right,
elected official and the staff was spot on. I mean, that's
right,
how
right,
they talk.
right.
Deferential sometimes in public, but behind the scenes,
Yeah,
brutally honest.
yes,
Um,
yes.
you touched on the news media, and let's go there. One of my frustrations with mainstream media is we'll call it the Woodward and Bernstein effect. That ever since the mid '70s, the news media has rewarded tearing down government.
Yeah,
And I'll give you an example. I went on a trip when I was a Senate press secretary to New York, and there were about 40 of us. So we got some pretty cool meetings, including Tom Brokaw at the time,
mm,
the editor and anchor of the NBC Evening News. And I was able to ask a question. I said, Mr. Brokaw, every week you run a show and a segment called The Fleecing of America. And it's
yeah,
by quota, you got to run a negative government story every
right.
week. Why not have the same requirement for a positive government story? And his
Yeah,
reply went
yeah,
like this. He said, Brad, we don't cover the story the day the bank wasn't robbed. But
right.
if that's the case, doesn't that lead to people thinking that the only thing the bank does is get robbed every day? I mean, talk a little bit about the incentives and the culture that is mainstream media, especially at the national level, and how that can contribute to a lack of trust in Congress.
Yeah, yeah. No, so you pointed out a lot of the times the things are reported are negative, and that does have an effect. So, I mean, that's kind of baseline, a big factor. It's also the case that television news, and this is as you highlight, the kind of legacy mainstream stations and ABC, NBC, CBS, but cable news as well, of course. They often tend to interview the most ideologically extreme members of Congress, so the very left wing and the very right wing members. They don't tend to go to moderates as much. And when congressional activity, there's some evidence that when congressional activity is framed as partisan conflict, that decreases trust in Congress. The people trust it more when they see that the parties can work together, there's compromise, there's negotiation. That actually, for the majority of the public, of course, if you're on the very far left, maybe you don't, but the majority of the public likes that. And it increases trust in Congress. But that's not what makes exciting television news is sort of Marjorie Taylor Greene and AOC, right? And that's not, they represent their districts. Again, this is a little like I'm not trying to say they don't deserve a voice, but moderates deserve a voice too. The public deserves to
Yeah.
hear from them as well. And this occurs most strongly on television, but this actually occurs in print media, including even, say the New York Times. There's evidence that that goes on there.
Wow.
Um, it's also the case, and again, I actually kind of like some of these shows, but these high conflict political shows like Crossfire. So I personally am a fan, but they tend to highlight this conflictual dimension of Congress. And again, when that's done in a vacuum of other information, that tends to lead to lower trust uh, in the institution. So if you're seeking out roll call, and you're also reading, other forums, and it's a very different phenomena, obviously. So that's where, again, yeah, it would be nice if there was more news about the sort of negotiation, compromise, moderation. It would certainly lead to higher trust in Congress. And it wouldn't have to be phony. That's the thing, is that basically people are only getting part of the story.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just actually was at a forum not long ago where two senior staffers, one said, there's a lot more interest in getting things done than you would believe by
Yeah.
walking the Twitterverse. And
Oh, yeah.
I mean, members, I've worked with them for 40 years. I always depress friends at the dinner table at Thanksgiving when I'm outside of the Beltway, and I say, look, most of Congress are decent, hardworking people that are just disagreeing with other decent, hardworking people. And they,
Yes.
when I say that, I occasionally on C-SPAN, I get some interesting calls from the hinterlands of America that don't obviously see it that way. Let's
Right.
shift to our focus now from external to internal.
Yeah.
Congress is not completely blameless here,
Yes.
obviously, and there is some role. What
Yes.
are some of the internal factors that are contributing to a lack of trust in Congress?
So there's an increase in a focus on partisan conflict. Now, some of this, as we've just said, is the media, but in fact, there is more elite level party polarization and less focus on kind of negotiation in committees. Parties have centralized policy, kind of the much more of the policy making role, the central kind of party leaders. They've kind of shifted, not entirely, but they have shifted in their direction. Major legislation and committees are less powerful. Committees tend to work in a more bipartisan way. Policy expertise is more respected. That's not to say there's no party expertise at the policy. I don't want to be unfair to majority leaders and speakers, but obviously it's a bit more partisan when it's being run out of the party leadership. And when the public sees Congress as having elite level party polarization, they tend to associate that with dysfunction and gridlock. And lower, it signals that Congress is mirrored in more bickering and failing to serve the people, and more about partisan conflict. So Congress could do something about that. I mean, that's within Congress's control. And it's a second factor I'd highlight is fundraising. Now, again, people want to get reelected. I get it. I don't want to tell anyone something that's not, going to get them reelected. And some of this is in Congress's control, and some of it's a little outside. So it's a mixed area to the previous question. So McCain-Feingold was really well intentioned. But in today's world, where you have super PACs and where challengers have a much greater ability to raise on the internet than they did, so Feingold starts, in the mid 90s. So it's kind of right as the internet's taking off. So it's not a major fundraising source. So by the time it gets enacted, it started, but still not as dominant. And so I get why the incumbents, they don't want challengers to have all the ability to raise. And McCain-Feingold took this out of the hands of the parties, right? So one thing Congress could do is they could undo McCain-Feingold. That's in their power. That's not outside their power. That's how it was enacted. That's not a court ruling. And in fact, there's a case that's been going through that may give parties more of, may effectively undo McCain-Feingold. Whether that will happen and the court will save Congress from itself in this sense, I don't know. That's kind of my view of what the court would be doing. Because now with the super PACs, it's unclear why every super PAC can have all this ability to raise these large funds, but not if you're the Democratic or Republican Party. That's shut
Or the
off.
candidate, right? Yeah.
Yeah, or the candidate, right.
Yeah.
And so the court may allow the parties to do it. But the way things are now, without Congress undoing McCain-Feingold, they rely a lot on the individual members to raise for each other, right, through leadership PACs. And so members are spending a lot of their time fundraising. That's not great for trust in Congress. So, then the public gets this perception, and you see this in polls, how much do you think Congress represents people like me? Right. And if what members are doing most of their time is fundraising, that's not going to lend you to believe, the general public to have high trust in the institution. So I think there are things that could be, as we said, some of that is Congress has done to itself. Some of that has been due to forces outside congressional control, like technological developments. So it's kind of a bridge area of where they could do more to help themselves, even if it's not entirely Congress's fault.
But don't we also have a factor of individual members often, frankly, bashing the institution? I remember watching the 2016
Yes.
presidential debates. Both the Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on anything, only that Congress was corrupt. From Senator Cruz to former Senator Clinton.
Yeah.
And they say that special interests control them. And I really was yelling at the TV set, really, Senator Cruz? Is that how it works in your office? Really, Secretary Clinton? Was that how it worked when you were in the Senate? It doesn't work like that. It doesn't.
No.
They don't have strangleholds on how you vote or what you do, but you're out there bashing the institution, so people are going to buy into it.
Yeah. And actually, Brad, as you, I'm sure know, since the 1990s, actually organized interest have become a much lower percentage of members' fundraising. Most of their fundraising now is from individuals.
And small dollars.
Yeah. It's small dollars, and it's moderate, like people hitting the limit with this candidate
Well,
and
then
then
the
giving
super
to the
PACs,
next
as you
candidate.
point out, which is a
There's
wild west
right.
of
And then there's
fundraising.
super PACs, but the super PACs are also primarily individuals, right? They're not, it's not sort of, I think in the 90s, as we know, most of the money was from PACs. But over time, PACs have stayed pretty steady, and individuals have gone way, way, way up with and the internet's probably, a key source to that. And then some court rulings which have facilitated the super PACs.
Let's end on a positive note. The toughest question is we've already alluded to some of the things that can be done to improve trust in Congress. But what are some of your additional thoughts on what can be done to improve trust in Congress?
Okay, so there is an optimistic note. There are absolutely things that can be done and that Congress can do. And as you indicated about talking to members, a lot of these, when you talk to members, they want to do, right? Across both parties. And actually, although moderates are perhaps more interested in doing some of these, it's not limited to moderates. Right. There's sort of a sense among members that this could be done and that it should be done. The first thing would be, and I'll, Brad, as I think you know, with Matt Chervenik, who's the CEO of Sunwater, Hoover and Sunwater co-led this task force last year that brought together a bipartisan group of former members, former staffers, and academics, where we proposed procedural and rules reform, and that would revitalize that. In this case, our focus was on the House, but many of these could be adapted to the Senate as well. So revitalize Congress. One thing Congress could do that we propose is it could change its procedures to encourage and rules to encourage more bipartisanship. So, for instance, right now, there's supposed to be preferential treatment this is just one example. We give many in the report, so people can, I won't repeat the whole report here. People can go to Sunwater's website and see it. But you're supposed to give preference to amendments that have 20 members of each party. And we propose, let's just lower that to 10. If you have 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats who
Yeah.
support an amendment, give it a floor vote.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it has to be enacted. People can vote no. But put these strongly bipartisan amendments to the floor to encourage bipartisanship. And that kind of bipartisanship is what raises, that sort of, even seeing that the proposals are being considered, even if there's conflict and it's conflict that's sort of not purely partisan, that would increase trust in Congress. We propose other ways in the task force that would reward committees and members for investing in policy, rather than say showmanship, bipartisan bickering, and to, allow committees to, have more rulemaking, or not rulemaking, lawmaking authority than they do in the current context where almost everything's going through the speaker's
Yeah.
office, particularly in the House. And so one of our proposals was to have something called guaranteed regular order. This could be for one bill a year. It could be limited to budgetary authorizations where, of course, regular order has, largely gone away, and enable them if they went through the traditional committee process of markups, of hearings, again, to have consideration on the floor. It doesn't mean that the bill would be passed. It just would give members an incentive. What we heard over and over again, and we even did, it's in the report, some statistical analysis of, is that members felt their work on committees, they would get a strong committee proposal and it wouldn't be considered on the floor. And then you just, at a certain point, why do you even, and that they felt they had the votes. What we do know is that increasingly committee proposals were not being considered on the floor. Obviously speakers' offices will say, no, we don't, there was a reason, so we don't. But I will say that some of the people we spoke with from speakers' offices originally said, no, it's not true that increasingly committees can't fit their bills on the floor. And we collected that data and we said, actually, we were open to your argument that it's not true. We collected the data and it is true. And in fact, it's probably worse than it appears because people are increasingly not spending their time in these areas. If you think a bill's not going to get to the floor, why would you spend all this time? And then I'd note, that outside of our task force did not focus on campaign finance reform. I've been on other task forces that have, and I would say there, which we already talked about, giving here actually, while in the legislative arena, I'd like to give more power to committees and kind of on fundraising. I actually think this is where parties are really could be very helpful. Right? That this is what parties do. They find, they should be finding great candidates. They should be funding those candidates. They should be, and it shouldn't be, and again, in other work, we've shown that if the parties can't be the main fundraisers, then extremism does pay in the fundraising arena, right? And so the types of people who are likely to emerge, if it's all on the candidate, are more likely to be extreme. Now, some people may say that, that's a normative judgment on my part, that I think it'd be better to have more moderation. But what is certainly true is that for trust in Congress, having more moderation and bipartisanship would increase it. So I'm willing, whether people want that or not is a normative judgment, but I'm willing to be on that side, that I think this would be a good thing for our democracy.
Well, Brandice Canes-Wrone, you've touched on so many wonderful issues on a very complicated and extremely important topic, trust in our government and trust in Congress. Thank you for joining us today for the Good Congress.
Thanks, Brad. It's been a real pleasure.